live at the corner. We're on air now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what happens when the long-established binaries dealing with the internal and external human categories of subjectivity and identity, as well as sexual and gender, have to come to terms with the technological transformations from the digital to the algorithmic, and from the algorithmic to the artificial intelligence? How do these unprecedented shifts in reality and perception transform the 20th century category of biopolitics? Can we observe and rename the body politics of the 21st century to acknowledge the increasing role of autonomous machines in shaping humanity and its latest image? So, as part of the public programming of Francis Ruyter's solo exhibition at FRANZ Josefs Kai 3, Hurricane Time Image and Body Politics will bring 3 artists and theorists whose research predominantly deals with the questions of technology, sexuality, gender, and body to discuss their research in relationship to the exhibition and the themes embedded in Ruyter's painting practice. So we begin our discussion with Maryna Makarenko. She couldn't join us today. She's joining us digitally from Berlin. How did technologies of modernity that subvert gender develop from times of the English Renaissance? Effeminacy, discussed in Renaissance England by anti-theatrical writers, was caused by cross-dressing practices common in theater. The story of the Roman Emperor Nero, who married a young boy named Sporus, clearly illustrates how non-reproductive sex nulls the logic of reproduction. Does the English Renaissance's fear of effeminacy still run through the algorithms of contemporaneity? Maryna Makarenko combines performance, dance, and moving picture to examine structures of existing orders. In her works, she explores interconnection between notions of technology, gender, and economies of feeling. Yeah, go ahead. You got the mic.
Thank you, Mohammed, and hello, everyone, and congratulations to Francis with the opening of the show. I'm very happy to be part of this gathering and to make my contribution to the discussion. So, as Mohammed just introduced, I'm going to talk now about the fear of effeminacy in clothing and cross-dressing practices during the Renaissance time. So when we speak about clothing, it is important to understand that it functions as an extension of our body. It almost becomes our skin or even our armor that protects us from the outside world. And clothing is also a technology to alter the human subjectivity and hack the gender algorithm. And through altering our physicality through direct contact with the skin, clothing becomes our second skin, entering other layer of self-identification. Dress not only emphasize social conceptions of masculinity and femininity, it also serves as an indicator of one's social status. For example, during the 17th centuries, those who deviated from social norms by dressing as an opposite gender were thought to suffer from illnesses, and they were recognized as sick. For example, transvestism was been received differently through different time periods. In many cultures, cross-dressing was associated with homosexuality. And for example, during Renaissance, the cross-dressing was initiating controversy in different ways. But even though this practice was very common in theater among male and female actresses, so actresses performing one of the dual gender roles in the Shakespeare plays could wear trousers, for example, or another elements of male clothing. Also, cross-dressing was popular among courtesan women wearing heeled shoes or of their lovers. So, sorry. Another element used among female actresses to cross-dress was a codpiece. It's a shell that was protecting male genitals. Codpieces originally come from the military, and it began its history from the time of the 100-Year War that finished in 1453. So warriors were wearing codpieces made of iron. And some writers of that time were writing that first piece of armor among men of war was a codpiece. So the function of codpiece was enhance genitals and also intimidate the enemy. And after the war was over, the codpiece traveled from the military to everyday use. And then it was functioned also as a pocket for men to hide different small things. And then during the Industrial Revolution, this element was abandoned, and it was seen as ostentatious and vulgar. And another element of the clothing that was used for the female actresses for cross-dressing was heeled shoes. And probably many of you know that the history of the heeled shoes starts from the Renaissance time, and the heeled shoes was the symbol of masculinity and wealth, and initially it was worn by men. So men who were not very tall or who wanted to appear more masculine were wearing heeled shoes. And then another trick was also to have the extension of the shoes in the toes. That was also making figure taller. For example, such figures as Louis XIV in France or Charles II in England were big fans of heeled shoes with red soles. And so then after that time, heeled shoes were forgotten. And then only in the 19th century, they came back because some photographers of pornographic postcards in France realized that women's bodies look better wearing heels. So after that time, it was coming back of the heeled shoes. And as we understand them and perceive them today as an element of the female body or extension of the female body. So coming back to the effeminacy in the Renaissance, a phenomena that discussed in England by anti-theatrical writers such as William Prine, Stephen Gosson, or John Reynolds, that was caused by cross-dressing practices common in the theater. So the story of the Roman Emperor Nero, who married a young boy Sporus, is the one that illustrates quite well the fear of effeminacy that could lead to the acts of sodomy, a non-reproductive sex that breaks the algorithm of reproduction and was against the rules of the Catholic Church. So to talk more about the story of Sporus, is important to say that Sporus himself was a young boy who was favored by the Roman Emperor Nero. And Nero, after being married twice, believed to be a very cruel person. So when he married his second wife, the same year, he also met Sporus and fell in love with this young boy because Sporus reminded him very much his first wife. And Sporus was appearing in public quite often with Nero. And when they were appearing in public, Sporus was dressed as a woman. And it is also believed that Nero castrated Sporus in order to be able to marry him. So during the Renaissance, this story was very popular in theater. And but for actors, it was believed to be dangerous to play the role of Sporus, because to play this female role, they had to wear dresses, and at that time, it was believed that this act could turn them into a woman. So to us today, this idea might sound absurd or even naive, but at that time, it was perceived very seriously. So if to look generally at the face of the Renaissance fashion from the lens of modernity, one can describe it as very colorful, with a lot of red, blue, gold, or silver, men wearing tights. We see men wearing white tights a lot. There was a lot of decoration and accessories, such hats with furs or feathers. Also, there were a lot of feathers on the shoes. There were corsets also for men, and the fabrics for men and women were very similar. And today, the idea of clothes is in a way turning upside down and crisscrossing one another. So things that were normal during the Renaissance could potentially cause a conflict today, of course, depending on the geographics. And such attributes as tights or heels that were initially male today can cause a fear of effeminacy. So yeah, that's shortly my presentation. Yeah, I don't know how we would proceed.
Okay, I was muted. Oh, yeah, that's okay. Thank you for that. Okay, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to maybe read the abstract while we're waiting for your computer to reboot, because usually it's like Murphy's Law, everything has to go wrong. So you open your screen and the computer was all crazy, right? Okay, so when John Money invented the category of gender in order to socially classify newborns whose morphologies were sexually unclear, it became an encryptor and not a descriptor, just like so many technologies that produce subjectivity. Fortunately, these epistemologies, which fabricate capitalism's industrialized sexuality, CIS or CIS, can be easily decrypted through reverse engineering, seizing the biotechnical means of subject production in order to create our own freedom, our own body, our own public and private architecture, and our own categories of understanding and meaning. We're still waiting for the computer to reboot. And since I was muted, I'm just gonna read the first sentence of your bio so it gets recorded in the archive video, right? Ibai, Gorriti is not a performer, but rather a stage where critical industries perform their agendas. Very creative bio you have here.
So I'm not wearing heels to make a display of wealth. Just making sure.
Did you guys coordinate so you wear heels and then?
I had no idea. I had no idea.
That was just coincidence.
But I'm very happy about it.
Yeah, I was very happy that she brought it up.
Same.
Okay, here we go.
Okay. So, yeah, I wanted you invited me to give this talk. There was this White House press conference, maybe you remember, and Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro announced as if it was any news that they would stand against what they call the gender ideology.
Gender ideology.
Yes. And although I hate that we're still talking gender, and especially that we're doing so in the opening of so-called trans artists, women artists, just as we're only talking race when, for non-white artists, when please, it is male, cisgender, white openings where it is critical to put this on the table, to have these conversations. But I mean, we're quite masculine now, so I think we're fine. And I don't even know what to tell you. I must be the most confused one when it comes to gender. So I just keep thinking and reading about it, and sometimes even experimenting with other parts of me that are not my brain. And I'm more than happy to share my small findings with you in this amazing environment that is Francis Works. So I thought this gender ideology would be a good starting point, because the majority of people, even feminists, even trans people, sometimes think it was some feminists who came up with the idea of gender in the 60s, in the 60s, and created this whole mess. When, well, that's what the Trumps and Bolsonaros want us to believe. They say in order to destroy the national Catholic family, and they love to bring this up as a major emergency because, some people are navigating this made-up category of gender and we don't know what bathroom to allow them to use. Well, just as Donna Haraway didn't invent the idea of cyborgs, the idea of gender was invented by was not invented by philosophers, but in a research laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in 1947. Which, is this moment of Cold War where the present we are living and suffering today was invented through so many technologies like the computer, the internet, but also heterosexuality, the nuclear family with mom, dad, the kids, a car, and a dog, each one with their own scripted personality and gender, which is this technology developed by John Money we call gender. What's interesting about it is that it was an artifact that this artifact that apparently is destroying society was invented to prevent it from falling apart. They were researching the psychological development of intersex babies, so they came up with this category of gender not to denaturalize sexuality, but to normalize the subjectivity of bodies that escaped the binary. So in front of the scientific evidence that multiple chromosomical combinations, that means XX and XY, are not the only two possibilities, and there's an infinite more morphologies beyond and between the penis and the vagina. Instead of accepting this new reality, which of course was an epistemic crisis just as big as accepting the earth was round, as it changed the whole common our whole common consciousness. So instead of that, they started describing these babies. So instead of describing these babies as intersex in their legal documents, they decided to inscribe them as within the binary to facilitate their socialization. That's what they will claim, as either male or female through this category of gender, thus scripting their whole life, which is the case for everyone, regardless you're intersex or not. By the way, any of you could have been born intersex, because many of them are never told and they find out as adults. But in any case, gender is this script, is this encryption, if you want, into which we are boxed at birth, rightfully or not, with consequences for the rest of our life. And I believe this very brief history of how gender came to be is telling us a lot about the nature of science, the hospital, the modern stage, which appeared simultaneously. And Foucault has this beautiful book called The Birth of the Clinic, about the absolute perversion of medicine as a space where reality is not described, but instead is produced. No surprise if I tell you that every chromosomal combination that's not XX or XY is considered a pathology, because the only body to be considered legal, normal, and sane, what I call capitalist industrial, within what I call the capitalist industrialized sexuality, is not only the one that's gendered, but the one that can fall in love with another body that will allow them to reproduce and produce younger workforce. Any disability of deviation from this project can be technically fixed via operation rooms or medication, which is two different ways to approach the body as an architecture that had a lot to do, that have a lot to do with the technologies available every moment. Am I talking too fast? Okay. You know, I'm gonna go through these two approaches to the body. You know, the first one was the mechanical body. Descartes is taking place in this very analytical and necropolitical moment of history where the whole world is being divided and sliced into different parts, countries, taxonomies. So the same is happening with the geography of the body. It is colonized by medicine through different departments, organs with different functions, very schematically, the digestive system, the nervous system, the circulatory system, you all know that. And of course, the reproductive system, which makes no sense. To begin with, the mouth or the anus have been sexual organs since forever. But even if we are to establish a very hard distinction between sex and reproductive acts, it's quite hard to reproduce without the help of hands or other senses. But this alleged autonomy of organs, which I'm quite interested as sculptures, allows medicine to make implants or donations possible, and also sex rearrangements, surgeries, which from what I know are quite plastic and aesthetic, since so far the vaginas and phallus they produce are not reproductive yet, but you still need the government to approve them, often by very controversial methods. And whereas you are free to modify your nose or your boobs without telling anyone. So I think it's important to think about the different status of our different body parts. Who owns them? Do we own them? Does the state own them? Not only for trans people, but also abortion, which, as you know, is the other great threat against white families for the very same reasons. And with this, we move towards the other approach, which is drugs, the pharmacological complex that will explode in the mid-century period we were talking before. And just as the mechanical body, it takes the technologies available at the moment as a metaphor to conceptualize bodies as a bunch of signals being sent and received between organs. The many information and communications theories at the time will function as blueprints for the development of pills and injections, which we can imagine as sort of emails or compressed information packages with different instructions that biotissues can respond to. So of course, when Dr. Pincus and Rock discovered that estrogen and progesterone intake could technically break the relationship between normative heterosexuality and reproduction, they knew they had something with huge political power. You know the story, the pill of the sexual revolution, etc. But because of its political power, anti-obscenity laws in the 50s didn't allow doctors to spread any information about contraceptives. So the researchers for the pill had to move the human trials to the colonial enclave of Puerto Rico, whose government was trying to manage overpopulation. And they target what they saw as a colony of poor women of color in Rio Piedras in an attempt to demonstrate that if they could follow the instructions, then women anywhere in the world could follow them, because they were saying that the pill would be too complicated for women. And this is the racist and misogynistic history we are taking as users of the contraceptive pill or synthetic estrogen, because the main use of hormones today is not done by trans people to achieve new bodies, but by so natural cisgender people. And because the body of woman was perhaps to be understood as a site of reproduction, only as a site of reproduction of new population, the Food and Drug Administration rejected an initial version of the pill because it eliminated periods, questioning the fertility of white American women, to whom a second version that faked bleedings was marketed as a symbol of their liberation and independence, clearly at the expense of women of color. That's why Black feminists will reject the contraceptive pill, but also at the expense of other animal species, just as pretty much all scientific experiments. Yet we still claim absolute distinction between computers, humanity, and animality. So last time I was in Vienna, Mohammed and I engaged in a bit of a happening by having some synthetic testosterone at Café Bruegel. I have some over there. If you want to show, you can pass it. There's also some contraceptive pills. Yeah, that's up to them. And this one you're using or seeing or touching, I don't know, this doesn't come from animals, but early synthesis of the hormone came from mammals for sure, and many farms still produce animal bodies for the beauty and pharmaceutical industries. So I don't know where we're going to go from here. It seems like the next model we are going to adopt to understand the body is the quantic one, as quantum computers seem to be the next big thing. And I'm quite excited by the promise of existing in two simultaneous states, or none of them, as I reject the male-female binary. Not sure if I want to embody both or none of them, but I'm ready to experiment beyond any false opposite, not only girl, boy, but also good, bad, natural, artificial, and fantasy and truth. But I don't quite believe we are there yet. Maybe the metaphor to understand where our bodies are right now is the cryptocurrency. Gender is clearly encrypted at birth, but also it is clearly a currency. So far, a very undemocratic one, just as like the state-controlled money. Far-rights, conservative populists are very aware and scared, and they are right. YouTube is making their kids gay, just as Hollywood was making them straight. So transgenderism as a conceptual framework, just as feminism or Marxism, is a powerful philosophy, I believe, that can rearrange society. And what's groundbreaking about it is that it embodies institutional self-critique, understanding the body as an subject that is itself an institution up for change. Also an architecture we've never had any objectivity about it, because our subjectivity moves along the object of a study, which is ourselves, right? For instance, when workers protested against factories as a space of slavery, they failed to admit the dynamics going on in their own households, where their wives were providing all sorts of caretaking and reproductive labor. Theirs was to be just half a revolution, if anything, or more like dethroning the kings to occupy their space, which is what we've been seeing again and again in history. And that's kind of the basis of our democracies. You can now choose your master for the next 4 years and then roll the dice again. Then there's this other liberal fallacy of be your own master, be your own boss, or design your own body. But this is the danger we are facing, I believe, to play the game of power. And we need to invent an alphabet of freedom, a language that's not a prison. And I think RuPaul Drag Race is a great example of diversity as a spectacle, as queer baiting, the cashing in of identity politics to keep promoting the very same structural violence that we claim to fight. Scarcity, individualism, competition, ableism, Darwinism, and toxic masculinity, after all. I mean, it's again about being a queen or a queer hero selling your community to be in the cover of Vogue. We need to pay close attention to how much is encrypted onto us. I think the only freedom is full decryption. And with politicians and corporations using underground cultures as commercial vehicles for consent, it is the master who is using our tools. How to dismantle the house now? Well, this is the question for everyone, I think, these days. And this is the risky task of our time. And climate change is pressing, by the way. What relationships to establish with the pharmacological industry, with operating rooms, or with the body itself? I think gender today, after the theological, sociological, or biological assumptions are decrypted and falling apart, is precisely this relationship one establishes with their body. Maybe an obedient one, following the scripts of capitalism, industrialized sexuality, producing and reproducing, maybe a disobedient one, rejecting production and reproduction, or maybe an strategic one, as a currency, as an avatar, as a proxy, or a mask that allows to navigate life. So after many years of queer and trans discussion, transitions, deceptions, I only think it's a good beginning, but there's nothing inherently radical or emancipatory in choosing the gender of your partners or your own body, but what relationships you establish with them. Okay, it's a liberation to love or exist beyond genders, but I think we have to use this framework to decrypt much more than this. And I love the title of this exhibition. The time is in the title of this exhibition because it's something I'm very interested in lately, is the history of time, as this historical enforcement of linear objective time, just as gender has been enforced. This immaterial grid is clearly an architecture to me, and is also the product of enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, but I don't think we have time for this today. But just maybe in the discussion. So just saying, because we're talking about gender, what we are talking about gender applies so much more to that's just as oppressive. And often I'm like, you should all transition, but then I realize we're all in this big transition, and that's a way more complex one.
You want to stay, or you want to switch with Laurence, and then we get back on the stage? Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. So we went from the skin to the body, and I think we're going to now go into the psychology and go one level deeper with Laurence Rickels. Laurence Arthur Rickels is a psychotherapist and literary scholar. He's a professor of psychoanalysis and holds the Sigmund Freud Chair at the European Graduate School, EGS. He was a professor for art and theory at the Staatliche Akademie der Blinden Künste in Karlsruhe, Germany, and for comparative literature and German arts and media theory at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Rickels is known for his work on mourning, as well as his highly original psychoanalytic readings of such diverse topics as National Socialism, the State of California, vampirism, and the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. Without further ado. Can you hold the mic, or do you want me to hold it? Could you? Of course I can. No problem.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation, of course. My text, Between a Crypt and a Date Mark, is in 4 brief sections. 1. In 2016, Mohammad Salami set forth 4 or 5 discursive events of the mid-20th century that informed the paintings by Francis Ruyter based on archival photographs from that era. I would squeeze inside that frame the prehistoric event of Daniel Paul Schreber's Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, as well as Freud's interpretation of the document, Psychoanalytic Notes on an Autobiographical Account of a Case of Paranoia. 3 of the reinventions of interpretation on Samity's list fall under the sway of this double billing. Walter Benjamin's allegory Avi Warburg's image ethnography or visual studies, and Gregory Bateson's aberrations of feedback. The breaking news of Schreber's delusional system stabilized around the central fantasy that bent his gender to meet a new world order that was coming round the bend. When Philip K. Dick transferred the Schreber case to his first science fiction novel, Time Out of Joint, he recognized that the legibility of Schreber's document relied on tendencies traversing the B-genre science fiction and fantasy. Dick retold the stabilization of Schreber's psychosis as the story of a community rerouting the protagonist's breakdown away from the brink of the unconscious through an alternate reality of fantasy. The small world, after all, of fantasy secured under conditions of surveillance is what Weir's The Truman Show owes to Dick's novel. Early in his career, Benjamin formulated and reformulated a brief theory of color that was specific to Fantasie, that of German Romanticism, to be sure, but which already indicated the predilection he would realize in his outright appreciation of Disney's art of animation. I quote, "The color is moist in nature, the medium of changes and not symptom. Like in a rainbow and the Laterna Magica too, in fantasy, the color is completely contour. What is typical of fantasy in contradistinction to the fantastic," Benjamin underscores, "is an intrinsic Entstaltung, or unformation." Benjamin, all fantastic forms have in common a constructive moment, or from the perspective of the subject, a moment of spontaneity. True fantasy, in contrast, is unconstructive, purely unforming, or from the subject's vantage point, purely negative. The vibe of fantasy coloration draws on phosphorescent shades of decay and the violet of violence. The unforming tendency of fantasy ultimately upends the sense of an ending, which, Benjamin writes, never leads into death, but rather renders the decline it summons eternal by an endless relay of transitions. That Benjamin's theory of fantasy coloration is on the same page with the daydream and Tolkien's genre is evident when Benjamin turns the palette into a container. He writes, "Fantasy can be kept under control only through such contemplation of colors and fully developed and satiated in relation to them. Fantasy is at once a style or genre and the mental faculty, the wayward kin of the imagination, which ethics and aesthetics have ever sought to counter and contain." Freud displaced the opposition between innocent and antisocial fantasying by introducing the notion of the Zeitmarke, the date mark, the indelible impress of the present moment that triggers a daydream. The arc of fantasy, however, is a jump cut from an idealized past to the future of fulfillment. It outflies and denies the present moment, which by the date mark it bears, nevertheless awaits historicization, fantasy's half-life. 2. Freud saw the main production lines of Schreber's New Order, the technological and the archaeological, carry forward endopsychic perceptions, inside views of the overall functioning of psychic reality. These genres of delusion correspond to B-genre, the influencing machinery extending through outer space to science fiction, and the netherworld of souls to fantasy. By their contest, both B-genre opened up what must be considered a borderland of fantasy and science fiction, which is the Heimat of blockbuster culture ever since the hypnotizing success of Star Wars. That it is hard to identify the genre content of Lucas's film reflects the contest between B-genre to which it owes its projection. I think I can get used to doing that now too. Thank you, though. The science fiction that Golden Age authors like P.K. Dick stood by, with their backs turned to the seductiveness of the fantasy genre, explored changes analogous to what was packed inside the World War II origin of computing. But in addition to the dislocations in time and space associated with rocket science and atomic physics, the computer also held in store the digital relation, which science fiction didn't anticipate. Benjamin's derivation of modern allegory from the shortfall of Christianity's purchase on the future applies to the techno-fantasies of science fiction. No longer bound to predict the future, its former calling, which in light of digitization it flunked, science fiction becomes a seat of allegory. With the arrival of the digital relation, the prize in the forecast contest among B-genre had to be handed to fantasy. If the fantasy that is true is no longer the gospel, Tolkien's definition, but instead digitization, then fantasy becomes the genre without borders, the subsuming genre of fiction. The unmooring of fantasy from its belief system through the genre's affinity with digital magic occurred in tandem with the revaluation of the ways in which both fantasy and science fiction are imbricated in their attachment to a poetics of flights of waking fantasy. By reading in the ruins of its faulty forecasts, science fiction illuminates all the date marks and crypts hiding out in the borderlands it shares with fantasy. Gotthard Günther started out a German philosopher and logician, recasting through Hegel the binary logic associated with Aristotle as but the prehistory of a more comprehensive, multi-valued logic. Upon emigrating to the US in 1940 with his Jewish wife, he discovered the local industries of cybernetics and science fiction. This is the hard part. Although Günther doesn't address fantasy, neither the genre nor the faculty, in his study of what he calls the American apocalypse, he does allow that the science fiction under consideration is still provisional, reliant more on daydreaming contact with the remote future, which Günther quickly distinguishes from what is merely fantastic, Fantasterei. The contact high of sci-fi anticipations reflects, he writes, a slowly awakening speculative consciousness which begins to set itself goals in its daydreams. The radical break from Europe as last resort of the regional civilizations hailing from the East, which Günther claimed was the content of American science fiction, must be understood in tandem with cybernetics, which demarcates new scientific, logical, and physical frontiers. But the science in the fiction conveys the enormity of the anticipations. Günther, such a science, when it does arrive, won't be an isolated spiritual or psychic phenomenon, but rather an integral element of a new civilization with a new metaphysical a priori and with new primordial life instincts. 3. In her 1994 review article, Sarah Rossiter uses the metaphor of rotoscoping to evoke an inversion of photography and drawing in Francis Ruyter's early self-portraits. Disney excluded both indexical realism and abstraction from the musical visualizations in Fantasia. However, before the exclusion of indexical capture, there was the spectacular failure of its attempt in the first fantasy film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. There is an identification with lost causes that can carry a failed attempt further along the range of influence than many a successful technique or formal decision. Disney's animation of nature, which was already styling with animism between late Romanticism and the comics, was available for filming the fairy tale. But the human protagonists, for good or evil, the queen, the princess, and the prince, struck a different balance in regard to the evolutionary trait of neoteny, the retention of baby face features, which we find reflected back in our favorite mammals. Rotoscope was used to incorporate the film record of human actors inside animation art. Francis Ruyter closes his 2019 essay, Transness, Mansness, and a Life's Work, on the image of tents gathering around art exhibited in Miami as seen from above. The figure of the tent, in particular of tenting, joins rotoscoping in the uncanny looping of preservation through elimination, which is the crux of the work of mourning, according to Freud. In his analysis of the Schreber document, Freud compared the psychotic's withdrawal of all libidinal connections with the world to the experience of mourning. That he could as readily have explained the withdrawal in analogy to the experience of an illness, like the common cold, means that in Freud's theory, the work of mourning partakes of the power of the psychotic break to evacuate reality and project a new world order. The creative unconscious by Freud's close colleague Hans Sachs is a psychoanalytic aesthetic theory turning on the daydream as the linchpin of the beautiful arts. It is getting late in the study when we learn that music is the art form which comes nearest to being the pure embodiment of beauty. Up to this point, Sachs drew on an eclectic spread of linguistic and visual works from ancient Greek sculpture and drama to Mickey Mouse cartoons in order to test Freud's thesis that art rescues the omnipotence of thought from the off-limits underworld of daydreaming. However, when he describes an instance of beauty's musical embodiment, something more like a sequence of visualization from Fantasia results. Every artist begins by renouncing the drippy primary narcissism of his private wish fantasying and receives in exchange the prize of beauty, conceived in accordance with secondary narcissism as a goal of perfectibility that, always just out of reach, draws the artist onward. The beauty of Sachs's argument is revealed in the excursus on music. When the music plays, the work of art is shown to guide each member of the audience toward an experience of an emotional situation which has been his potentially. Whenever we relate to beauty, the highest form of psychic life, we are brought nearer to essentials. A thing of beauty represents and brings home a precise nuance of an emotional situation. Beauty in which the presence of death makes itself felt in sadness realizes in the palette of fantasy nuance the aim of every work of art, the representation, not the description, of a specific emotional situation. That the emotional situation isn't a description means that the influence of its experience has been isolated and preserved, like the princess in her glass coffin. The artwork is a kind of dream catcher with beauty as bait. It isn't any old oceanic feeling from prehistory, however, but a specific situation which bears the timestamp not so much of fantasy incentive as of lapse in the timing of affective response. What lags behind in sadness is the missed opportunity to convey the truth of what was felt in the emotional situation. The demand for this completion is inexhaustible. The beauty of Dichtung, Freud's summary term for art, is that it allows us to mourn the missingness of the affective response in the lost emotional situation. Affection deficit is suffered over the time of our own response. We feel a work of art as though we could catch up with the lapse. Affect isn't repressed, but the out of timing of its response haunts us. 4. In Francis Ruyter's 2011 essay, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the momentum of image transfer and production can be seen to replace the egoic motility of reality testing. But we also find the uncanny impact of the capture, attempt, or inclination. In this essay, which summons mostly ghosts, the pervasive wish to take or take out inspires the artist to introduce, I quote, zombie havoc. According to Jim Jarmusch's Only Lovers Left Alive, we are either vampires, old world connoisseurs and collectors of the detritus of the recent past, or we are New World zombies. The demolition derby of the New World, according to Gunther, cannot pick up the interim lack of a new metaphysics. For the time being, the experience that man isn't capable in the long term of living without a metaphysics of his own, and that he therefore cannot produce history, has not yet been made or registered in the New World. The local carriers of the history to come have not yet suffered metaphysically. The epic of this suffering, however, lies ahead. It is the inescapable consequence of human aloneness. The aloneness and emptiness belonging to the period of transition, the waiting around for the conquest of space, is the negative historical aspect of the decline of traditional supports, which also has positive implications. Günther. This ambivalence of the spiritual situation is a necessary precondition for a positive historical future of the New World. Mere suffering drains, reduces, and makes sterile as long as it isn't able to transcend itself into something other. Günther registers the zombie as the identifiable symptom of the onset of a suffering that could supply a restart of consciousness to match the prospect of outer space. A starting point for an American metaphysics of death, the idea of the zombie as it stands is nothing other than a mythologization of the tendency to separate out all elements of death from the life of the soul or psyche. Any content of the psyche, however, can be objectified and attributed to that which is factual or dead. The consequence of the tendency for which the zombie is mascot, therefore, is that all phenomenal life can be assigned to the realm of death. Perceived life isn't life, but a walking corpse. Günther identified the mechanical brains already being designed and built in the United States in the 1950s as the technological version of the idea of the zombie. Günther underscores that so much that earlier epics considered spiritual was really only matter of fact, sachlich, in fact mechanical, and that the mechanical brain is the technologization of what the zombie mythologizes, the overcoming of finitude by getting it over with already, by excluding it until that's all there is. Günther sees the zombie emerge out of the aftermath of a logical impasse. He writes, "A zombie is a walking corpse in possession of a second and dead life, and because he has already died and thus left death behind, is immortal. But death is absolutely unique. You cannot die twice." Horror fantasy and science fiction excel in confounding or adumbrating this commandment, which the zombie seems to update in its function of walking target. Knock it over and the truth of the unique death, that is the second death, shines through. Getting rid of the dead, making them dead, is the thrill-a-kill dynamic of zombie entertainment. However, by the transformation of the vampire alone into a mess of zombies, see Richard Matheson's science fictionalization of the undead figure of occult fantasy in I Am Legend, the double has been amped up to extend through multitudes. That there are more than 2 deaths and lives in American science fiction means, according to Günther, that not even life and death are linked and separated by a completely dyadic disjunction. Thank you. You want this?
You want to take the chair? Wow, a lot to cover. We don't want to take too much time, but it will be interesting. I don't know. I would maybe like to start like backwards, right where we ended. As you were speaking, so I don't. How do you feel about the figure of zombie here? Because I think we need to maybe talk about it in a little bit positively, right? Like we want to like take away the fear and take away the negativity from the zombie as far as as far as your discussion and how it relates to science fiction, technology, and then the kind of transformations that we're talking about here is concerned, right? Or you disagree?
No, I tried to indicate that at the end, that on the one hand, the zombie is instrumentalized to obtain the thrill of making sure the dead are dead, or twice dead. What was really accomplished through this amping up of the vampire into not just another vampire or a double, but into this multitude, means that the zombie breaks out of the double dynamic or dialectic, which is the positive thing.
A young philosopher I work with, Daniel Sassolero, has this theory about basically trying to find some commonality between the project of Marx, Freud, Foucault, not so much Derrida, which is your territory, but more like Deleuze, of how basically that their work can all be considered as a way of sort of showing a hidden layer of what we don't know. In fact, inserting something into the discussion and pointing to it. Of course, with Marx is it's political economy that gets highlighted as something that wasn't seen. With Freud is the unconscious. With Foucault is this spirit of governmentality that runs through the history, and with Deleuze, which gets more highlighted with later on as sort of like a philosopher of networks, by showing us the sort of rhizomatic structure of the world, another sort of invisible structure, right? So how can we sort of point to the role of science fiction, if science fiction was a philosopher, or if science fiction can be seen as a force that kind of and this thing you highlight, this undead figure, that then in a way you can say you know what I mean, the way you discuss how the figure of the vampire gets multiplied into the zombie, right? So then imagine how sort of what internet did to it, which is even just made it even more.
You want me to say something?
Yes.
Yes. What was the question?
Basically, do you agree with this reading?
Yes.
I guess you don't feel like discussing this a little bit, because
No, I mean, I could just rephrase what you said. You gave a list in the philosophical realm, a list of collectible thoughts and words, which parallels what I try to do in working with B-genre and popular culture. I try to find a discourse of collectible figures, and through allegorization, use it to read the current situation. So yes, what I tried to do, you could also have done with Marx and Freud, and using all the big names and words of philosophy. I tried to do it within popular culture. But it came to the same potentiation of a new frontier, for lack of a better word, through the overcoming of the double dynamic. It's opening up to multitudes, which you linked to the digital relation.
So,
sorry.
Ibai, it was really interesting the way you sort of you laid out your sort of research, and then you came back to sort of make a distinction between the way you describe what's going on and what you identified as sort of shallow identity politics. And because these things are very entangled, right? For a lot of people, it's hard to separate the two. And this is also goes back to the original discussion we had at Cafe Prukel, which resulted in us inviting you here. It would be really nice if you can maybe untangle this a little bit more. How do you see them separate? Because you kind of went over it in the paper fast, and I think that's like one of the most important things you brought up for me. How do you distinguish between this sort of like neoliberal notion of like you can remake your body versus this more sort of like deeper and more meaningful way in which we engage almost in the same act, but for a more sort of collective or for a social transformation aspect of it?
Yes, well, that's super complicated. I think that's where we all are as subjects and objects of study at the same time. And this kind of shortcoming was something I was trying to highlight historically, and it's not yet resolved, of course. But I think it's about being very honest, and I'm very interested in like first person research, like not only reading but thinking from other parts of the body, like the skin, like taking substances, for instance. And of course there's like this big history, and but also there's like the concrete thing that's happening to you that may relate or might not relate to these bigger stories and bigger yeah, that of course are made by small stories. So what was your question again? Like, I don't know.
With you that the term gender was introduced by a research team of the Hopkins University, but that it was introduced by Simone de Beauvoir in 1949 in her most famous book, The Deuxième Sexe, which was sold only in America about 1 million copies. So I think she very strongly working for the next decades to have this term spread and as a Kampfbegriff, as we say in German, as a fighting term rather than just a philosophical term. So I don't know if we
Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I totally agree. Like Simone de Beauvoir and a few other people were already thinking about gender for sure, and I mean like the actual like the definitive move towards establishing gender as like a rigid category and embedded into legal systems and everything will be like the UN, a UN like forum, or like what is it called? I don't know. Like one of the summits in 1995, and of course it's taken from the medical research, but also it was influenced by Simone de Beauvoir and all these writings for sure. So it's but you, what year did you say? So yeah, like John Money was doing that at yeah.
Your date was when?
47. No, but I mean, but that happens with most inventions, right?
Chronologically, you have an argument.
But it wasn't like two separate things. I think both were influenced. I mean, I'm sure Jean Monnet was aware of the writings of Simone de Beauvoir for sure.
Especially if you 12 million copies.
Yeah.
So maybe it's time to talk to Maryna, like just waiting there patiently and listening on. Thank you so much for staying with us. It's getting dark in Berlin, I guess. We started and it was sort of like a daytime.
By the way, I'm not in Berlin. I'm still in Kiev.
Yes. So yeah. So you know, the interesting thing that I thought maybe you can like expand, and maybe people have some questions later, is that how you kind of like you made it clear that like, so like if fashion is an extension of the body, then the whole notion of performance becomes like an extension sort of like outside of the fashion, right? Like not outside of the fashion, but it kind of builds on what fashion already builds as a sort of like extension. And how this whole discourse of performativity itself can be somehow rewarded or what's the right word, reframed as itself as a form of technology that can be somehow added to this, like the way we've been talking today. Like, because you talked about fashion, and you talked about like clothing and shoes, and then you talked about these two different ways of body transformation, one through operation and one through chemicals or like medicine, and you went deeper inside. And what's interesting here, and maybe you can help us, right, is like the fundamental importance of this like change of attitude that has to happen internally, that happens like, well, both as on an individual level has to happen, click there, but also in a sort of like social imaginary has to happen. And it's something that basically we have to agree that we fail to do. Sort of like we fail to sort of like this scientific knowledge, like how you described it, right? It's almost going from the flat earth to understanding the earth is round. It's almost from like thinking like the earth is in the center of the universe, realizing that earth is not in the center of the universe. It's kind of like that type of attitude. Like, what has made us fail to establish this beyond ideology and turn it into like something not only like a part of a collective worldview, but beyond that as an indisputable scientific fact? And I think you think it's just a matter of time that we haven't sat with these findings long enough for everyone, including the right-wing people and the Nazis, to also accept them, or there's something fundamentally cultural, ideological about this that is not a matter of time. Like these scientific knowledges that we've produced will never going to become accepted the way the roundness of the earth was accepted, and the way the place of earth in the universe was finally accepted, that is not in the middle. Is it a matter of time, or you think this change of attitude, this collective imaginary will switch? We're just impatient, maybe. Something maybe you can also address, and you can also address. Maybe we start with Maryna.
Yeah, wow, there is so many questions inside of this one big question. So I would maybe start talking about generally the idea of technology and like how we understand technology nowadays. And I could say from my personal experience, for me, technology is everything that alters my perception of myself and others. So basically, everything that is not my body, for me, is technology. And clothing is, in this sense, also technology. And I talk because I'm practical artist, filmmaker, performer, dancer, and for me it's always interesting to get in the direct contact with technology and clothes, and to observe how it changes my inner state and what it does to my mind. And in this sense, like when you were saying now about time, time is very crucial moment, because the more time you spend with something that is not you, the more it becomes you. So basically, when you wear a piece of clothes, at first it's not you, it's something that is outside of your body, but the more you spend time with it, it becomes you. So in this sense, there is this merge of technology and then the extension of the body. But answering your question about like why we fail all the time, I don't know. I don't have the answer yet. Maybe Ibai or Laurence can have the answer to this question. Why are we failing?
Yeah, I wish it was a matter of time, but even with the Earth, it's. I mean, it wasn't quick at all. It was like centuries or like pretty long, and it took like lives as well. So, I mean, wishfully thinking we could be a little more civilized this time, but doesn't seem like so. And then I think, I mean, research is totally interested and most of time knows perfectly what's going on. And I mean, I presented for what to me is a clear example of science knowing some facts, some like reality, morphological reality, and responding to it with like a construction like gender, which of course I was thinking, I mean, I think it was very useful for the conservatives, like the whole the success of these ideas, of these feminist ideas, because what has happened is that like what I claim to be the actual I mean, me and many people, it's not my finding at all, like the actual advent of gender has been totally covered up by this idea, this feminist idea that of course it's very it's very progressive and has a lot of positive ideas for society, but there's this like yeah, it kind of backfires into covering up like the actual scientific advent.
Yeah, the the only thing I would want to add right now is that certain changes have already happened. They might not be the big changes, but if we just think back across the recent past in the United States, the Obama years, I think, clearly demonstrate that through digitization, all the names, events, what have you in history return, but as entries from the digital archive. So Obama's victory was not the triumph of the civil rights movement, but the return as an entry, referring to that. And in at the same time, all the religious right events returned as entries from the archive. But they return outside of the original historical context of opposition. It's all quite short-lived and doesn't have much staying power. So that already changes the course of what we used to call history.
Very lovely insight. But part of it, I think maybe we can also think about it in terms of like both the language chosen and the approach, right? At least since the framework that you set, right? Like a lot of these, especially with the information that you brought to the table, right? These scientific concepts were instantly radicalized and used as a form of politics, right? And then when you do that, of course, there's like benefits to doing that, but also the drawback of it is that you allow the opposition to sort of like dismiss its scientific validity and look at it as a kind of like political weapons, right? Rather than some kind of like new objective findings, right? We were just recently in Sofia. Me and my partner, we curated the Sofia Queer Forum, and the word that they posted the main newspaper posted the exhibition as an event, and the event received like about 700 comments, and 690 of them were negative, and they were actually embarrassed to show us the webpage because we could easily use Google Translate and read all the horrible things that these comments were. And this wasn't a right-wing newspaper; it was like a center-right newspaper, and yeah, they completely dismiss all of us, and they call us gender people because it constantly came up as like so for them, feminists, like basically instead of calling they don't even use liberal word anymore. So the bad word is no longer liberal. It's just like gender people. It's like, oh, you're gender people. And all of a sudden you're like this enemy or some kind of like a crazy person, right? And it's interesting because they don't even like, homosexuality is kind of normalized a little bit, but gender people are more dangerous. So you can be straight, but be a gender people. Or you could be gay and just go to the gay bar and do your thing and not participate in genderness, and you're fine because you're just personally gay or something. But the minute you're discussing it or taking a position, regardless of your actual like sexual orientation or anything, you become gender people. And to me, this is, it kind of relates to what you're saying, but we really have to wait to see if this, what you're saying, is short-lived and it's just like a return of a past and it won't last long and it's like a foam on the ocean and it's just going to go away. Is it really going to happen, or this backlash is something more longer lasting? And if it is, it's something that we really have to strategize around and think about ways of reframing what we're saying or approach it a little bit differently in order to sort of like combat this. But your ideas were very like intriguing, and I think maybe that's a good place to sort of like be hopeful and maybe pass it on for some questions too. I'm gonna put you on spot as planned because you're the artist, right? So do you want to like say a few words or about the talk and about like these issues, because we've been talking about something that you personally have dealt with and have written about recently.
I'm not sure where to begin, which I don't know. I'm sort of still like absorbing all of the information. I mostly what I want to say is thank you, all of you, for bringing this to the show, because it's you know, you tend to make work and you're in your studio all by yourself and you think nobody else is like thinking about the same ideas that you're thinking about, unless you have a great curator who is like inspiring you for everything. So I really appreciate it. I kind of don't have an immediate response, like specifically to anything, because there were just so many ideas in there. I'm kind of astonished, actually. I would say we could continue it. I also, you know, we were also supposed to be starting an opening at 15 minutes ago.
We're not doing that bad though for time.
No, we're doing, yeah, it's okay. So 15 minutes, yeah. I do think it'd be nice to offer people a chance to say something. So we have some, and can we do, yeah.
Yes, I'm gonna pass the mic.
Thank you. I think Laurence made a really strong metaphor. We skipped that, and I want to go back a bit, the zombie thing. I mean, it's the dead of the dead, as Lars Bangsan writes about it. So it becomes a kind of question about life as beings that have to pay all the time, like paying beings, buying water, and defining space through capital. Where does this space left for the life itself? I think that is a good metaphor. And thinking about, I don't know why in this show I also thought of the invasion of the body snatchers, the Philip Kaufman film that is already a kind of early promise of internet, like this space plant duplicating all these bodies and throwing back, especially these fibers going everywhere. I think in this show, this long-term practice that continued dealing with its ontological questions give us a clear metaphor like zombie. A motorbike metaphor comes to us. Like when you look at the exhibition closely, like Laurence's great metaphor of zombie, not only a sexual or body kind of reference point, but deep in the meaning that can question the other forms. I think the motorbike metaphor is very strong. Machine metaphor is very strong. And I would like to ask actually first of all, Francis, how those motorbike series and the motive appears in relation to your transition, your understanding of image and image making.
That's an easier question for me. And, you know, the motorbikes are from 1994 or so, and I had been making these pictures, like in the first, like the pictures behind here, which were putting together an archive of images just that I was interested in, and this outlining thing was a way to bring them all on the same kind of level. And I thought of it as a reference to this invisible architecture that had no author to it, that was defining how we move through the world. And I would explain it as satellite systems and radio. And, you know, I looked recently at it, or like in 2008, I was looking at this work again, and I was like, oh my God, this is like the internet, but this was before anybody was really using the internet so much. And just in the process of working with this, you know, I was like, okay, I've defined a worldview, but what am I going to do with this knowledge? And, you know, the self-portraits were my way of saying, well, I really thought of it in terms of ownership. And I was like, well, what subject, I'm a boring person. Like, what is something that I really own though? And, you know, early 90s was very much this kind of birth of identity, like in art, like somehow this like, you know, of course, because of the AIDS crisis and all kinds of things like this. And so I thought, okay, me, I own me. That's like, at least I know that. And so the self-portraits came. And after I was trying to like kind of develop this into something, and I thought of categories, and I would make pictures that were all cars, or pictures that were all people or animals, like in a very expanded sense of the word animals. And when I came across the motorbikes, I realized this was a perfect metaphor for like the bigger thoughts I was having. It was a kind of perfect cybernetic situation. You had a person and you had a machine, and you had this advertising that was like a kind of extension of that relationship. And you had something internal. You had this idea of movement and speed. So there was like this, you know, no matter how you look at it, a motorcycle looks fast. It's like it's just fast. A what? Me? I have one photo of me like this big sitting on my uncle's motorcycle. But that's about it, I think.
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Francis. I have a question for Laurence, and it relates to the way that this show is in parts. Is the sequel, as in the serialization you've written about James Bond, so, you know, I mean, and you're writing about science fiction and fantasy, and there are films which come in parts. Is the sequel a zombie-producing machine? I mean, is a sequel naturally in and of itself a situation of producing the undead, you know?
I would say yes, but as I was saying before, I think the digital archive has also buffered that one. Now everyone is, every fan is an expert on the whole franchise and studies it all on the laptop and hunts for Easter eggs. And they just know everything. So it's just another horizon of what's replacing reading or something. So yes, I would like to think of it as zombie, but it's been buffered. It's been turned into something educational. It's not yet collectible enough to be allegorical.
So it's like the digital life, once it's like streaming, is a new life form, but as soon as it's archived and then reinserted, is like this becomes undead and is the return of the dead, right? Okay. Yeah. Because the early internet, it was mostly archival. But like with the speed going up, like right now with 5G, you're gonna have to split it into these two different streams. One is the one that's live and it's happening, and the other one is like this one that you're referring to in terms of the archive coming back from the past. But, you know, you mentioned something about how science fiction sort of like at a certain point it kind of like missed the importance of computers because they didn't really imagine it early science fiction, like pre-cybernetic science fiction, right? Did I catch it right?
Science fiction excelled at wrapping the whole kind of Schreber-esque possibilities that came out of World War II, the World War II setting of computing, its invention. But what I was arguing is that the digital relation itself, which was also, of course, waiting in the computer, is what science fiction missed. And that created a whole new order of reading, I'm arguing.
But if you can check. Sorry. What it reminded me of was like if the digital was missed, as you argued, the internet, and not more precisely the problems that this type of communication will bring to us was actually fantasized long time ago, and I'm sure you're aware of it, the story that's called The Machine Stops by M. Forrester, right? In The Machine Stops, humans all live, it's written in 1902, the humans all live under the earth, and they're connecting with each other through this system that connects them all for communication. And then because of living under the earth, they slowly become afraid of going above the earth, and then the machine perpetuates the idea that like above the earth is bad for you. Keep them under the ground. Yes, no, it's not a digital relation, but somehow internet relationality was theorized. No, of course it's not digital, but like this live part of it was this live communication, and then the mother and the son are communicating from two sides of the world to each other. The mother's skeptical of the machine, the son is totally into it. And what happens is, because they've been underground for so long, they forget how the machine was made as the generation passes on, and then they give sort of magical and godlike qualities to the machine. So when the machine starts to break down, they think it's God taking revenge on them. That is intentional. And then as the machine further breaks down, they still are in denial that this thing can actually malfunction. But by the time they figure out that the machine is breaking down, they've already lost the knowledge to fix it. So then the machine dies, and they all are sort of like condemned to some kind of a death under the ground. And then the very few people above the ground are supposed to rebuild the world again. That's how. But it's interesting how, you know, the digital was missed, but the type of communication we use was actually like fantasized in a negative form by M. Forrester.
Well, fantasy, as I argued, is closer to the digital relation than the projections of science fiction. But in that particular story, the author simply turned animism into a machine and gave animism a certain half-life.
So in a negative sense.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
So anybody has more questions? I'll bring it to you.
Laurence, in very common speaking, the difference between a living body and a dead body is that the dead body has no soul. The soul has escaped, gone, so it's not alive anymore. And you you might know the movie The White Zombie from 1938, where the zombies appear as workers in a factory or a mill structure or something. So from my point of view, the zombie image, which has become so fashionable, is the bodies working and having, or bodies living and having no soul, or not using their soul, or not referring to the soul. It might be more simple than you use to think, but this is my point of view.
No, that's a good point. I just wanted to add that as a footnote that, of course, zombie goes back to certain Haitian practices, and there we find the notion of using something like PTSD to create a kind of slave population. But when I refer to zombie, I'm in the middle of American mass culture, and I'm thinking of Romero's film, Night of the Living Dead. And he bases that on, he says anyway, that he based it on I Am Legend. And it's not until the sequel that he starts referring to the living dead as zombies. So you have to separate it out. It would be a problem if all zombies were simply occluding and messing with the specific problem of this Haitian predicament. But anyway, it's, I would argue that it's not so much a separation of the soul from life as it is the use of traumatization to create a service population.
You can probably take one more question, if there is one. Just one sec.
Would you introduce the show, maybe?
For that, I think we should give people 5 minutes a break and then do it, because we've been just like in a conversation, and I can stop the broadcast. And so yeah, so thanks for staying with us throughout the conversation, and thank you, Laurence, thank you, Ibai, and thank you, Maryna. I'm going to stop the broadcast and see you in Berlin, Maryna.
Bye. See you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.